Hello there, everybody. It's Josh and Gavandia. Welcome to Fusion. In today's video, we're going to discuss the very basics of Python. In this video, we're going to go through semantics and syntax. Let's get straight into it. Okay, so as you can see, right now we have a IDE that's open for us to be able to program in Python. The IDE that we are using is called Visual Studio Code. To get Visual Studio Code, you will go onto the Visual Studio Code website or visualstudio.microsoft.com. Okay. And you have two versions to choose from. You have your Visual Studio 2026 and you have your Visual Studio Code. So there's a difference between the two. Visual Studio 2026 allows you to program using .NET and C++. And Visual Studio Code is just like an overall editor that you can use for just about any language. Download Visual Studio Code. And then the next thing you should download is Python. So just go into python.org downloads, and then you should be able to download the Python you want. Here's different versions of Python that you can download. Okay, so that's basically how you can get to go to downloading resources that you need for this lecture. So I'm not going to go through all the details of what you need to download and everything because there's plenty of resources out there that really show you how to get the setup that you need. But I will explain this setup that we have right here. So in order to work with a folder or a file in Visual Studio Code, the first thing you need to do is create a folder. So as you can see, I've created this folder called Python Projects. And in this folder, I created another folder called Syntax and Semantics. Okay. So you can just about do the same. And then go into Visual Studio Code, click on File, go to Open Folder, find your folder, click onto it, and select the folder. The next thing you want to do is create a file. So we're not going to use a .py file because that's a standard Python file. Instead, we're going to use a project.ipynb file, which is actually the extension used for Jupyter Notebook. So to create a file, just click on this new file icon, project2.ipynb, and here's our file that we're going to use. Right, so we're not using that file. I'm going to move that to the recycling bin. Okay, so now that we have our project.ipynb file, the next thing you want to do is select a kernel that you're going to use. So you can see I've already selected my kernel as Python 3.12. If you click on this, it should come up with something that says choose Python interpreter, and then you're going to choose the one that you downloaded. So I'm using this one. Okay. Right, so now we have a Jupyter notebook. Well, there's a few things that you can take notes of in this notebook. One is that we have a plus code and plus markdown. So plus markdown is if you want to add any titles or comments to your code. So let's say, for instance, I want to talk about this is my first basic project. So this would be my markdown, and I'll click on this stop editing. Right, so here's the comment. This is my first basic project. If I want to turn this into a much larger heading, I'll click on this, edit icon or the pencil icon, and I'll use 3 hashes, make it a much larger. You can see it's a much larger title, right? I'm going to keep it like that. Okay, the next thing that you need to know is that if you want to create code, all you've got to do is create a code block, or actually, this might confuse you, but what you're creating is actually called a code cell. So I think that's more appropriate. So we'll say that it's code cell. So create your code cell. And in your code cell, you can basically type whatever code you want. And this is what we're going to use to be able to execute our code. So if we want to execute our code, we'll click on this execute cell icon. Right, so the first thing we want to understand is called syntax. Right, so syntax is the arrangement of keywords, punctuations, and characters that define a programming language. So you'll notice that when you program in C++, or let's take one basic language, or the first language you probably learned is the first language you would have learned is probably Java. So Java has certain syntax, like you have to use brackets to define blocks of code. You have to use a semicolon at the end of a statement. right? So that's every so that those are the kind of syntaxes that you have in Java. In Python, as mentioned in the introductory video, you can have a code block. Let's say this is my code block. X is equal to X is equal to true, right? So here's my code block. The first thing you'll notice about this is that when I assign a value to X, which is my variable, I don't have to use this colon and then an equal sign. Instead, I'm just using an equal sign. And secondly, I'm not using a semicolon at the end of that statement. That's one syntax. That's the syntax of assigning a variable in Python. Now let's talk about a bit more advanced versions of syntax. So I've got an if statement here, and I'm going to say if x is equal to, or instead, we'll just say if x. If x prints hello world, right? Else print good bye. Right? So if x is true, then we want to print hello world, else we want to print goodbye world. Let's take note of the syntax that's being used here. One is that we're using a colon to define the end of the conditional statement. Right? So here's our condition. Our condition is if x. What are we saying? That if x is basically saying if true, if x is true. Okay? We're also using a colon after else. And another thing to take note of is that for the code block that we're using under the if statements, we have an indentation to define that, to say that that's the next code block that you need to interpret. So you can't really do it like this. This would be incorrect syntax. You have to have that indentation so that the interpreter knows, okay, the code block that we're reading is this right here. Another thing to notice is that instead of doing something like um, console.writeLine or system.out, system.out, or whatever you may use in another language, in Python, we're using print. Okay? So now if I run this, it should say hello world. And if I change this to false, it should say goodbye world. Okay? So that's basically an idea of what syntax is in Python. Now, the next thing we want to discuss is semantics. Right? So semantics is the reasoning behind the code. In other words, we're asking, does it make sense? Is it a valid argument? So we know that if we say if we say A is equal to 12 divided by 0, this is actually correct syntax, right? Everything is correctly written. The order is correct. Punctuations are there. Some punctuations are not there. So this is correct syntax. But if we run this, you'll see that it gives us an error. And that's because it's actually the semantics that's wrong. Obviously, we can't divide by 0. So if we try to run this, and you can see it's got a division by 0 error. Okay. Another thing that wouldn't make sense is if we said A is equal to hello plus 1. So right now we're using two different data types. We're concatenating a string and an integer. But if we run this, you'll see it gives an error because you can't concatenate two different data types, okay, if they're in their base form. Right now we have hello plus 1. It only concatenates string, not int, to string. Okay, so that's another example of the syntax being correct, but the semantics is not correct. Okay, so we understand this. Get it up. Now, another thing that we want to look at is commenting in Python. There are two ways to comment. The first is a single line comment. For a single line comment, you simply put a hash before the words that you put down, and you type in whatever comment you want. So you'll say, "Hi, my name is Darshan." Okay. So this is a single line comment. If we want to use a multi-line comment, we'll use 3 apostrophes and we'll put here, this is a multi-line comment, right? So now one important thing to note is that if you're using a .py file and you type this and you have these comments, then none of these are actually going to show in the code. It's just there to explain the code or the block of code or maybe even the functions that you're using. In this case, we're using a Jupyter Notebook. So if we do run this, you can see it says here, it's doing this because, well, number one is that when you're using a Jupyter Notebook, you can actually define a comment using a markdown, right? So if you put this markdown here and you say, hi, my name is Yashin, then this is the comment that you're going to get, or the title that you're going to get, okay, or paragraph, whatever it is, right? So generally, when we use the Jupyter Notebook, we tend to stick to single line comments. But if in some case you do want to comment out code and you don't want it to run, then you can make a bunch of code a multi-line comment. And to do that, on the keyboard, you press Control/, and you can see it actually turns this entire bit of code into a comment of multiple lines. And if you want to reverse that, you'll press Control/, once again. Let's see what happens if I run this as a comment. You can see nothing happens. Now if I press Control/, takes that out. I want to do this again, and now it's working correctly. Okay, everyone. So that's basic. That's the basic syntax and semantics of Python. We covered comments in Python. We covered what's a markdown, what's a cell. Basically, looks at a Jupyter Notebook and all of the resources that we sort of need to start off with the first lecture. In fact, I wouldn't really consider this a first lecture, but this is something that needed to be mentioned so that you understand how we can work with Python. As we go forward in the lectures, you will come across different types of semantics and different types of syntax. So more of that will be explained in further videos. Right. So thank you so much for watching this video. Until the next one, Dashin out.